we'll have a session on sufficiency, and then Layla will help moderate a discussion on ways forward that'll go after Arnulf's talk. So we're moving things a little bit, but it's all meant to make this be a workshop session. We've done a lot of the sessions so far, have been a lot of presenting and one-way discussion. Hopefully with this group, we can think about new ways of collaboration, new ideas for future work. Okay, so that's it. Just a couple items. Yellow card, 2 minutes. Red card, 1 minute. We're going to enforce time so we have time for discussion. And then just to give an overview of the session, we're going to engage our remote participants. And so I'll turn it over to Yamina to briefly introduce the session from her perspective.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everyone. So this session is, I will try to share my screen if it's possible. This session is a kind of a follow-up to the work that was done in the IPCC report. As you may know, for the first time, we had a full chapter dedicated to energy, to the demand of services. And one way to summarize the full chapter, I think, is this graph that you could find as well in the summary for policymakers, which shows that demand actions on the demand side could reduce emissions up to 70% by 2050 if actions are put in place, if the right policies are put in place now. Compared to a baseline scenario, to stated policy scenario of the International Energy Agency. Importantly, when you look at demand reduction, what this chapter shows is that demand reduction is not only efficiency, is not only about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is what is in orange here in the graphs, but there are what is called in the chapter sociocultural factors and infrastructure use. The demand reduction through these two parameters, and these two parameters are what is grouped in another part of the literature under the sufficiency concept, which was also introduced in the IPCC report for the first time. And it is likely that the emission reduction that are shown here are much lower than what they could be in the reality, given that sufficiency was not an area of research in the past. So our session, as mentioned by Greg, we'll start with a discussion between Greg and Arnulf about the narratives to introduce high with low scenario. And then we move on to a sectoral perspective for low demand. And we have two sectors, one, the building and the transport sector with presentations from Benina and Aimé. And then we move to the sufficiency session, which will focus on sufficiency at local and national level, because unfortunately at this stage, global scenarios do not really include sufficiency in the modeling, or it's not highlighted as such. And then we will open discussion that will be moderated by Layla and Ba to see how to move forward in the future. Over to you, Greg and Arnulf. Thank you.
Thanks, Yamina, for setting a good standard by getting through a lot of material quickly. So I will, and just as a reminder, this is helpful to see, we're going to shift that first row on narratives to the end because it's well suited to stimulating discussion. So I'll turn it over now to Alessio, who's going to moderate the next session of talks. You are now the referee. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Greg and Yamina, for the introduction to this session. And I'm now glad to start with the presentations on the low energy demand transformation in sectors. Starting from the first one, we have Benigna Bozakis, which will present about low energy demand transformations in buildings. And I invite Benny to the stage.
With time. I will. So I'm going to talk about collaborative work we have done with an international community. Actually, 20 international scholars contributing to this activity, where we map existing or potential scenarios to their ability to represent low energy demand and decent living scenario aspects. And this has been actually led by Alessio and Laila, in the framework of the EDITS project, which I'm really happy to talk about afterwards during the break. Okay, that's a good start. So much about technology.
Bini, sorry, can you be close to the mic? I don't hear you well. Please,
Is it better? Yeah, we have an echo then.
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So first of all, we identified some of the, it's really loud. We identified the factors that we wanted to check for in the models. As you all probably know, a rapid final energy demand reduction according to LAD in 2050 compared to 2020, and at the same time an activity or growth or convergence to make sure that decent living standards are available for all in all regions. And we looked at buildings. Why? Because there is a large saving potential. Recently, Felix Kreutzig and colleagues have shown almost 80% greenhouse gas emission reduction potential only through demand measures. Because although the buildings sector is quite slowly moving because of the lifetime of buildings and the technological innovations, but at the same time, we already have all the mature technologies that can lead us to zero emissions. We also have behavior changes, lifestyle changes that are well known and could be rolled out. And at the same time, there are new social trends. So we started off from LED and the low energy demand scenario drivers. I was hoping Anup to go before me and talk about them, but what I'm going to skip talking about the drivers themselves, because we translated the LED drivers into the more traditional technology intervention, infrastructure intervention, social behavior interventions in terms of representing LED transformations, such as rolling out passive houses, rapidly technology adoption by wide-ranging societal acceptance, or infrastructure changes in urbanization, a convergence to maximum levels of floor space per capita. But we also looked at megatrends that are consistent or part of the LED narrative, because they also need to come through models that we have been looking for. So circular economy, sharing economy, decent living, and digitalization were the four megatrends that we looked at. And our aim was to so we looked at the literature, and we also carried out two-phase model survey to identify whether these are represented in models, and we are validating that these with experts. So what we found was that on one hand, there have been a lot of advancement in modeling the building sector from the classical IAM approach, where the buildings is represented as one block or a few blocks in practically the energy flow, towards demand models and service models, which are more heterogeneous and endogenized features that are relevant to LED. I'm will skip to the last slide to present how we looked at this. So we have looked at best practices and gaps, and just a snapshot of what we how we compare what the models that we identified include. And these are 13 models that we analyzed in detail. And you can see that why there is, as I said, a move towards more heterogeneity and the building stock representation, a service level provision, inclusion beyond economic indicators. There are drivers in the current models that that are relevant for the building heterogeneous building stock. Heterogeneity is usually building typology, efficiency groups, but a lot of focus is on residential and the global level, global residential sector, and in terms of geography, global and global north aspects. There's still a lot to do, moving towards comfort representation, more service representation, more welfare representation, heterogeneity through life ties, through the agents, through the actual drivers of building stock transformation, and to also include more modeling on non-residential and global south aspects. And finally, these are the models that we would like to thank for providing a lot of information. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Benny, for the presentation. We will now move on to the second presentation and then take short questions at the end of the two. So I'm now happy to introduce Aimee Aguilar Haber from OECD, and she will have a presentation on transportation and low energy demand.
Okay, so thank you so much. So I'm here and I'm representing the climate change mitigation team. We're in the Environment Directorate at the OECD. We are not modelers, but we work with models because we are working with policy and we need the models to show what these policies would bring or not. And just in a nutshell, why we started this work is because we started in around 2008 thinking of how come climate action is very much scaling up. We see a lot more funds going into it, but greenhouse gas emissions are still growing. So something in how we are designing our policies and choosing our policies is not being effective. And so what we thought is we need two mindset shifts. Firstly, we need to stop focusing on means and going to ends. We tend to focus a lot of our modeling tools as well as our policy priorities in GDP growth. The same happens at the sectoral level. If we see the transport sector, we have a very mobility-oriented type of policy rather than an accessibility and sustainable accessibility-oriented type of mindset. And that is problematic because it tends to lock us into high demand, high consumption systems that are not delivering well-being. So that's the first mindset shift. The second is that we need to go from parts to systems because we live in complex systems and these are the systems that we need to transform. So if we only look at parts, what we end up doing is to improve parts, keeping systems that are by design unsustainable. So when we look at both these things, what we have been doing is then being oriented towards means and towards parts. And that has led us to a decoupling logic when we're trying to decarbonize the systems that we have. And what we say with our work and what we try to do is to influence policymakers and support them in looking at another type of climate action, which focuses on, ends and systems. Why? Because the decoupling logic takes us to these type of scenarios. While we know that these bring much more uncertainty and that we actually would want a redesign logic. So a focus on redesigning the systems that we have so that we can actually transition towards systems that by design increase well-being with lower energy and material demand and low emissions by design. And that would allow us to get to these other type of pathways that the IPCC shows us exist, and that could increase certainty and also reduce the risks of not going into trajectories that will, in a short term, drop emissions. Now, this implies a new way of looking at policies, because with a decoupling logic, we tend to focus on the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg model is something that we use in systems thinking, and we focus in events and patterns that we treat exogenously. So as we see incomes grow, car dependence will grow, car ownership will grow, that is a given. So what we do is prepare for that, and we start focusing on policies that react or anticipate, such as we'll have to turn all of those cars into EVs. Now, with a redesign logic, we understand that behind those events and patterns, we actually have a system, and a system structure that today, for example, is a car-dependent system, that we have induced demand, that we have sprawled. So we need policies that transform. What does that mean for transport? That the highest leverage is not on improving parts, but on systems innovation, on improving the way those parts interact, which bring us to road reallocation, land use, new connections through shared services, which are never highlighted as core climate action policy. And it is problematic. And some key issues that we find in many cases with models for this narrative is that they keep on being very GDP-centric. They extrapolate exogenous patterns into the future. They ignore the feedback loops and the dynamics behind those patterns, including rebound effects. And they have limited modeling capacity to tell us what these transformative policies and for representing these transformative policies. So they tend to make us or reinforce the focus on the tip of the iceberg and disregard these low energy demand scenarios, which we hardly see, for example, when we look at the long-term emission development strategies of countries. But we also have important measurement biases, such as lab testing versus on-road emissions from cars, especially hybrids, unrealistic assumptions about future technologies, whether carbon removal technologies, advanced biofuels, which reinforce the idea that actually these type of pathways are very plausible. So it's just some food for thought, because I know that there's a lot of modelers here, and there might be important exceptions, but I think that what we're asking is how do we make them the norm? And also, if you are one of those exceptions, come to talk to me, because we would be very happy to try to set up some synergistic projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers for keeping the time and very interesting presentations. Now, I would like to open the floor for some short clarification questions, but we would also invite everybody to keep more substantial questions for the final discussion in the second part of the workshop.
May I ask question, Alicio, or not?
Go ahead.
Yes, Yamina, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question to Amy, actually, from the OECD. I was delighted to hear you as a representative of the OECD pointing to your project and what you are working on. My question is, do you have modelers around you considering the changes that you are proposing?
Not that many, I have to say. And that's why part of why I'm here today. I think there are some models that highlight some of the things that we're saying. We have the International Transport Forum in the house that starts to at least have accessibility and greenhouse gas emissions together as an outcome, and showing that you can have scenarios with lower mobility and higher accessibility, and that these are the ones that would help the most and will bring emissions down the most. So I think there is potential, and we try to talk more and more with more people doing modeling, but we find that especially in the countries with whom we work with, it's difficult to really, first of all, to make them think about low mobility or lower GDP as something that could be desirable. And secondly, to say, well, we have to start from scratch in our modeling. So yeah, any modeling capacity that is already out there could really help us. And we would be happy to engage in bringing that type of modeling along with our narrative to countries.
Thank you.
And I have a related question also for Amy. Since you do work directly with policy makers, are there any ways that this, advancing and modeling from parts to systems to think about these kind of more comprehensive approaches, do you find that that's easier for policymakers to understand, or is there like a new level of explanation that's needed when you say go beyond GDP and start talking about well-being and indicators that are kind of broader but more meaningful of what we want?
So I would say it's not always easy, because it comes with the challenge of not being perceived as someone who is telling them that all of what they're doing is wrong, and that all that they know is just an error, a mistake. But I think that what we have found very important is to do workshops. So as part of our projects, to bring these systemic tools. So for example, we just did a workshop with Ireland, and we brought them the iceberg model and other systemic tools, and they were the ones kind of putting their policies in the different places. And what I think is that if these was coupled with kind of, for example, in our workshops, coming with some modelers that say, look, it sounds challenging, but you could start to do it simply with these type of tools and so on, that could be very powerful. Because sometimes the limitation that we find is that then they tell us, but give me some numbers. Like, what if I change my policies according to the iceberg model classification and so on? I need to communicate to people and to my constituencies, what will that bring? And that's where we're limited, and that's where we need you.
Alicio, if there are no other questions from the room.
Thank you. Jerry,
No?
there's one final question from Helmut here in the...
Okay.
Also to Amy, it's actually not a question, but it's an invitation to talk further later. As we are starting a project this fall funded by Horizon 2020 under the leadership of Volker Krei here at IIASA, which looks at the circular economy and goes into the direction of looking at the demand side, and will also focus on mobility as one of the sectors. And I think this, and what we are doing is I'm from more or less industrial ecology, so we do material cycles and stuff like that. But we very much look at the material infrastructure aspect. So I think this might be an opportunity to put perhaps some of these ideas also into this kind of analysis. And I would be very much interested in that, because my thinking is exactly along the lines you have been showing here. So I think that we should perhaps explore it. Unfortunately, I will have to leave during the session, so, but perhaps we can connect up later. That's why.
For sure. Thank you so much. And I look forward.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I will hand over to Greg and Arnulf for the second part of the session. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yamina, there is one. Oh, sorry.
Yes, sorry. It's my turn, right? It's the sessional sufficiency turn, right? Alicio?
Yes, I'm sorry, I was a bit confused with the reshuffling of the parts,
Yeah.
but now
Yeah.
we get into sufficiency then.
Okay, thank you so much, and special thanks to Amy again. I am impressed to see that the OECD is going in this direction, because in the IPCC report, we identified the measures that Amy was highlighting, and they don't apply only to mobility. This is very important to keep in mind. They apply to all sectors, and in the IPCC report, we identified them as sufficiency policies, and we even have now a definition of sufficiency policies in the IPCC report, which includes 3 important parameters that we must keep in mind: avoiding the demand for energy, materials, land, and water. So climate policies must go beyond energy to decarbonize the energy sector, while delivering human well-being. So it's not about GDP, it's about human well-being, and for all within planetary boundaries. So without overshooting the 1.5 degree target. This is how it translates from climate perspective. Unfortunately, when you look at the IPCC report, you see, you try to find how often the word sufficiency appears, then it's a bit disappointing, because it does not appear that much, except in the building chapter, which was focused on sufficiency, efficiency, renewables. But in other sectors, it appears only few times. There are 2 reasons for that. One of them is that usually sufficiency measures and all the measures described by Amy, for example, are not labeled as such. So they are watered down, and when you look at the scenarios, it's very hard to find them. While in reality, we cannot decarbonize without sufficiency. And we see this from buildings between 1990 and 2019. We reduced the global emissions from buildings have increased. Efficiency alone, so technological improvement, which is the main thing that we have in the models because it's driven by GDP, contributed by reducing emissions by 49%. However, the lack of sufficiency measures have led to increasing emissions by 52%. So the efficiency improvement has been more than offset by the lack of sufficiency measures in buildings, and the same occurs for mobility and for any other end-use sectors. And unfortunately, when you look at to the futures, these are the scenarios from the International Energy Agency. There are no sufficiency measures in most of the scenarios looking to the future, aiming at 1.5 degree target. In this scenario, we identified a bit of sufficiency measures for the global north, but not that much. And in this one, for both global north and global south, however, it does not include all the end users. This is the reality of the models that were submitted to the IPCC database hosted by IIASA. However, as we are going to see now from the 3 interventions, you will see that sufficiency has already been modeled at national or at regional level. So the first one will be from Yves Marignac. Yves, over to you, who will share with us how sufficiency has been taken into account in modeling the French scenarios. Yves, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see my screen. I'm sorry not to be with you, but very happy to share with you the work of Negawatt, which is a group of experts created in 2001 in France, and which now appears as a kind of pioneer in introducing sufficiency in scenarios as a lever of deep sustainability. Our understanding of sufficiency is very much in line with the definition that IPCC has now coined in its latest reports. We very much see it. We understand sufficiency as a dedicated action on the nature, level of energy services delivered to end users, to be considered kind of prior to technical improvements through efficiency and substitution of resources. And yeah, this is really the global framework we're using to develop our scenarios. We've been working on trying to distinguish different levels or different leverages of sufficiency, starting with what we call servicial sufficiency, which deals with the intensity and duration of use of equipments, a more dimensional sufficiency, which deals with the size, the nominal capacity of equipments, and there is, of course, a very crucial. There are crucial issues with buildings and vehicles in that area, and a more organizational sufficiency that deals with collective planning and sharing, including very deep actions like urban planning, we very much insist on the fact that this is not only about individual changes, of course, but it requires policies to change infrastructures, to change business models, to change values. And we also emphasize that sufficiency needs to be consistently implemented, not only on things that relate to energy, but also in all sectors, including to deal with the non-energetic stakes. Our approach is also very much in line with the second part of IPCC's definition. We think of sufficiency in the terms of the donuts economy and the idea of reaching a safe and just space for humanity, distinguishing between needs and wants. And this really brings us to develop a lot of thinking about the relationship between sufficiency and equity, sufficiency and solidarity, sufficiency and freedom to some extent. And of course, the relationship between sufficiency and economic growth that needs to be measured by something else than GDP, as it was already mentioned. We also insist, based on our experience, that including building up sufficiency assumptions in scenarios is no different from bringing assumptions in other areas like efficiency or renewables. We define indicators, we identify potentials, we think of policies and measures, and we set our assumptions. And these are just a few examples of some of the assumptions we are using in our most recent scenario for France that was published in October 21. I won't get into the details of those, just, I mean, this illustrates the kind of indicators and numbers we introduce. I will rather comment the global impact of sufficiency as we measure it in our scenario. And you can see in those graphs that sufficiency roughly accounts, when we distinguish it from efficiency, for 20% of the decrease in the overall final energy demand, which in total amounts to a 50% decrease. But our scenario and modeling also shows that it contributes to meeting net zero carbon footprint emissions. It contributes to strongly reduce the net primary materials footprint of the French economy, and it brings multiple co-benefits regarding living conditions, regarding biodiversity, regarding health, that we could assess in relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, we also we develop a European project. I mean, we've started it 3 years ago. It's called Clever. It's a collaborative European low energy scenario on the European level, which very much embeds sufficiency issues. We've been working with our set of more than 20 partners on setting consumption corridors based on service indicators on the European level, and we're using it to frame our global assumptions. And the first results of this European scenario will be ready by the end of this year, and a first complete trajectory will be presented together with some recommendations by next spring.
Thank you, Yves. Thank you, Yves, for your excellent presentation and for sharing lessons learned from Negawatt, 20 years of modeling sufficiency and considering it as a pillar to decarbonize the French economy. Now we move from France as a country to a more regional level in France. We stay in France with Barbara Nicoloso from the northern region of France. Barbara, over to you. You have 6 minutes. Please respect the time allocated.
Thank you, Yamina. Can you see my screen?
We do, yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So today I'm gonna share with you the experimentation that the French NGO Virage Énergie has led in the north of France, in the Hauts-de-France region. Maybe you know the city of Lille. We are near the Belgian region and not far from Paris. So this is a region of 6 million inhabitants, and we created scenarios to show how energy sufficiency can be implemented at the local level. So we try to model the impact of energy sufficiency on energy consumption, and we choose to decline 6 strategic fields to describe how energy is important in our society. So we choose to have a theoretical approach based on literature review, and we make some hypotheses to see how a few shifts are necessary in our society. So we have to evolve from overconsumption to material sufficiency, which means reducing consumer goods, packaging, repairing, going to functional economy or circular economy. We have to evolve from an ownership system to shared services, for example, by renting or car sharing. We also have to evolve from centralization to decentralization, which implicate the relocalization of activities to reduce the length of the food supply chain, for example, or the energy supply chain. We also have to evolve from domination of ordinary jobs to get emancipated to the enhancement of free activities and autonomy. With energy sufficiency, we have to identify the way the job market influenced our energy consumption. We also have to evolve from the cult of speed, which is based on the fossil fuel energy, to slow mobility. By reducing distances, speed, and promoting public transportation, cycling, and walking. And finally, we have to evolve from an anthropocentric vision to a naturalistic vision in order to live within the planet boundaries, for example, by reducing industrial food, developing renewable energies, or low technology. So we can see that energy efficiency gives various options and practices concerning individual and collective aspects, and it is very important to understand that energy sufficiency is not only a technical question, but a political and a societal question too. So with this work, we try to evaluate how urban planning, transport infrastructure, work, and time organization influence the way population lives at the local level and consumes energy. We explore the political, societal, and cultural aspects of energy, and not only the technical ones. And we try to establish a sufficiency roadmap for local authorities and decision makers to implement energy sufficient policies regarding the food system, the industry, the building sector, and the mobility sector. So there is a various range of levers that you can use when you are talking about energy sufficiency. So we built 3 scenarios to explore the interaction between energy, agriculture, industry, consumer goods, building, transport, in order to identify the vulnerability of this sector if energy crisis or shortage were to happen in the years to come, or as it is happening now. The goal of these scenarios was to create a narrative to make energy sufficiency appealing by presenting it as a way to achieve social equity, to improve the level of well-being in the population, and as a way to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So we organize workshops with citizens and academics to build these scenarios in order to evaluate what could be the decent level of energy services and which energy sufficiency narratives could facilitate the understanding of climate and energy transition for local decision makers. We also use data modelization and evaluation of future energy demand by 2025 and 2050 to highlight that energy sufficiency could reduce the regional energy demand by 50% in the worst case scenario and by 40% in the best case scenario. So when energy sufficiency is combined with energy efficiency, the reduction of the regional energy demand can be up to 70%, which could easily lead to the implementation of a 100% renewable energy mix and the net zero pathway goal. Finally, to ease the understanding of our work by the local authorities, we try to show what could be an energy sufficient daily life in 2025 and 2050. So we show that new narratives and projection of future are necessary to show how energy sufficiency can become a pathway for local authorities to achieve the carbon neutrality goal through public policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Now we move on to André from Denmark. André, over to you. Is there a technical problem, I think, Laila?
Excuse me, do you have the microphone on for the presentation? We cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. There
Yes,
we go.
now we can hear you. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm not coming from a team of academic modelers per se, but more of architects and designers applying sufficiency in a case study here in Denmark. So I'll just dive right into the video here.
Sorry, Andre, are you using a video? Maybe it's better if you just go through your presentation. We are not hearing you, Andre.
Andrea, can you hear me? Please check your microphone if it is working. We cannot hear you.
And maybe Alessio, if you ask him, it's better if he shares his screen than sharing a recorded presentation. It looks for me that it's a recorded presentation that he was sharing.
Andrea, would it be okay for you to move to the presentation, share your screen, and we cannot hear you anymore? Now we can see your screen, but it's in presentation mode, but not in full screen. And we still cannot hear you. Perhaps we can suggest to move to the next presentation and come back to Andrea later. Yamina?
There are no other presentations. So the session ends with Andre's presentation, and then we move on to the discussion between Arnulf and Greg. Or maybe Alessio, if you can, because the recording of the presentation is on the platform, maybe if you can, from your side, show the recording, put on the screen the recording, and then we can hear. Can you try to do that,
Yes,
Alessio?
we will try to show that.
Since 2008.
Oops, I'm afraid we don't have the presentation loaded here, the video.
Okay.
Or is it?
It should have been loaded.
This one.
Because people were confused, given that they were asked to upload their presentations, to record them.
No, unfortunately, the file is not opening, so we cannot. It's a format we cannot open. So.
Okay, then I would suggest that we move on to Arnulf and Greg discussion. And if we can solve the technical problem with Andre, we come back to his presentation. Otherwise, we need to make sure that the recording of his presentation is accessible from the platform. Over to you, Greg and Arnulf. Sorry, Andre, we don't have time to sort out the problem right now. I am not hearing you at all. No.
Okay, well, we could just continue in the room and we get that figured out. That sounds good.
Now we hear you.
Okay.
Okay, good.
All right. So thanks, Yamina. So now we work on to the narrative section, which I think will be helpful for discussion. And the idea here is to put some stories together with credible scenarios that can build up this idea of how LED outcomes can work. And there's been two efforts to develop narratives within this EDITS project for low energy demand. And one is the one that Arnold will talk about, which we're calling the high with low scenario. So high well-being, low resource demand. And the second one is on innovation and thinking about pathways to scale up LED practices, behaviors, and technologies. And I think I'll just summarize some of the initial ideas from that narrative on innovation. One of the things that, well, I'll say two things. One is we've tried to have case studies that encompass the three sectoral foci of LED in the EDITS project. So one on industry, one on transport, and one on building. So we're doing a case study on additive manufacturing and thinking of how resource demand could potentially be lowered in industry through 3D printing and that type of thing. Second, we have Leila's doing a case study on shared mobility and how that can be scaled up and how those practices can be expanded. And then I'm doing a study on in the building sector on solar prosumers, how people can start to become not only consumers of energy, but producers of energy and potentially interacting with their neighbors and peers as well. And so those three case studies we're developing as a narrative. But one of the things that we've done as a result of that is to put together three categories of distinct characteristics of innovation in low energy demand. And I'll just list them here before I turn it over to Arnold. One category is on adopters and agents of change. A second is on services, and a third is on technology. And within the agents of change idea, we're focusing on having many heterogeneous adopters, peer effects and social norms being important drivers of change, meanings and value going beyond financial criteria, and then market failures being pervasive in the adoption ecosystem. On services, we're focusing on having multiple attributes and then new service provision, that non-financial attributes and social acceptance become really important, and that rebound effects are always lurking and may need some kind of governance to deal with. And then on the technology, we're citing some of the work from Charlie and Arnulf about small granular scale, and not just that characteristic of the technology, but all the other things that that brings, such as incorporation, active behavior of agents and adoption, customization, and things like that, links to circular economy, network effects, so that where infrastructures, where more and more users actually make the technology and the behavior more valuable, looking at high technology readiness levels, and then also thinking about important roles for general purpose technologies. And the one that stands out most clearly, especially with Charlie's work on digitalization. So when we start to put these ideas together, we can start to think about how we might think about innovation in an LED context. And we're going to be using these case studies to develop some narratives of how we have a pathway to scale up from where we are today to some of the outcomes in the next 3 decades. So I'll leave it at that on that set of narratives, and then I'll turn it over to Arnulf to talk about the high with low scenario.
Thank you very much, Greg. I actually will talk about the high and low, but not only, because I'm a little bit sick and tired of being always the odd low demand scenario somewhere in the corner. And we spent a lot of thinking and ink about writing the narratives for these scenarios, but they are marginalized. And we need a different framework, and we need a different set of scenarios. And that's my main argument. So what I would like to discuss today is the need for a new and more versatile scenario framework within the IPCC or the wider research community represented here that complements, ultimately replaces the SSP RCP framework. This is a proposal by myself, okay? And it follows from 3 main insights, which I had already previously, but which were emphasized again at this scenarios forum. The first insight is that the use of scenarios has broadened substantially beyond the traditional climate-only focus. The second insight is that the interest in the analytical and research community has shifted from, and I would say this is so dominant, it's overwhelming, the shift from representing scientific baseline uncertainty to the interest to explore alternative policy pathways to achieve desired policy outcomes. And still in our scenario architecture, everything is dominated by representation of scenario uncertainty, baseline uncertainty, which hardly anybody uses, even not the SSP authors themselves, as we have seen in the bias of the mitigation scenarios, which only rely on a single SSP. The third insight is that the interdependence of issues and synergies, as well as the trade-offs between solutions, are becoming more and more understood. And they require a systemic endogenous representation in the scenario process, rather than the tradition of ex post impact and sensitivity analysis, which we have done in LED and which we have seen for the negawatt scenario as well. Laudable to do this ex post assessment, but not good enough. It needs to be incorporated directly in the scenario process. So what should be the organizing principle for this? And I'm making you a proposal today, and I will illustrate it with a brief sketch of this high with low scenario narrative. The objective is not to propose you a final framework and have you adopt it. The proposal is to invite a discourse, and I hope we'll have time in this session to at least have the only session in this forum where we might have some of the discussion and not only presentations. Okay, so here is my proposal. Point one, the focal point of the new scenario framework should be on the broad area of sustainable development rather than climate change. The organizing principle should be on different implementation strategies and pathways, their uncertainties, risks, and benefits. Third, the scenarios need to be holistic and capture the most important systemic interdependencies, taking the inherently systemic SDG 12 as an entry point. That means focus on consumption-production interactions, and with these interactions cover all SDG salient resources: water, land, food, energy, materials, as well as the environment. So moving from low materials or low energy or low food waste to low on multiple dimension scenarios. Now, how we would organize and implement this. So the example comes from this EDITS network of researchers that focuses on demand side transformations. And the high with low is a scenario which is an extension and partial revision of the original LED scenario storyline, which was very rich and extensive. Okay, so this storyline, contrary to my proposals for the scenario architecture, is a collective effort, and my co-authors are here, with the exception of Shonali that caught COVID. So Greg, Charlie, and Shonali joined forces. So thank you very much for joining the forces. I take the brunt of the criticism, no problem, okay? So the basic idea was, let's work a new narrative that reflects also some of the changes and the lessons which we have learned since the original scenario storyline was created. We've heard in the plenary that actually people say that this revision of a storyline should be a very lengthy and process and happen only after a long time period. I tend to disagree. I think reworking storylines needs to be a continuous intellectual process. Whether you publish it regularly or in which interval is then a practical question. But as an intellectual exercise, you need to always to revisit how convincing your scenario storyline is and the narrative. Okay. So we basically have chosen to focus on three main scenarios drivers, in addition or complementing the original ones. I'm not repeating the original ones, okay? And the three scenario drivers that are in the core are decent living for all, digitalization, and innovation. And innovation, I understand with a metaphor. It's a tripod. If you want to have change on the top, you need three pillars or a three-pod. You need innovation in behavior and social processes. You need innovation in governance and organization. And last, but certainly not least, but last, you need innovation in artifacts, in technologies. In this order. And these innovations co-evolve and are mutually interdependent. There is no behavioral change hardly without organizational change or technological change.
Exactly.
There is no technological change without organizational and behavioral change. And I think this is important to emphasize. Whether we'll be successful to nail this down very, very convincingly, succinctly, remains to be seen, but it's a continuous process, okay? And the objective of this scenario storyline is to basically describe in the narrative generic pathways towards sustainable development. And then we pass this on to our colleagues who explore in more detail the concrete social, economic, and geographical contexts under which these generic transformations will unfold in different pathways, obviously, and the necessary local adaptations that are required to make this pathway viable and socially acceptable. In doing that, obviously relying on models. So this is the first step of a larger kind of model elucidation exercise. We call it a modeling complementarity exercise. So to draw on the strengths of relative models. So I was actually very heartened by the previous session on sufficiency, because what you guys call sufficiency, I call sustainable development. So it's a little bit an elephant in the room kind of description problem. The obvious question is, when you say we need sustainable development as a core entry point, we need understanding what sustainable development is. And it's quite interesting for me, knowing the history of the sustainable development discourse, how ideas are coalescing. These ideas are not new. They have been first formulated by Madsen, Anderson, and Clark in their Pursuing Sustainability textbook. And it is basically a framework, if we twist it a little bit and modify it, that echoes the previous definition. It is sustainable development provides for inclusive well-being, well-being for all, respecting planetary boundaries, and building up all necessary components of development capital. So that's the definition of sustainable development which we have used. So that means also that we need to be much more cognizant and clear in our representation in the models of the different forms of development capital. Knowledge capital, innovation capital, physical capital, human capital, social capital. These are all important forms of development capital, which needs to be represented in the scenarios and ultimately in the model. So, with this definition of sustainable development, we then can start to develop a narrative of how do you achieve this sustainable development in a world which we call high with low. High levels of human well-being with low resource consumption and low impact on planetary boundaries and resources. So this is the basic logic. And using these three drivers, we focused particularly on the interaction and the cross-cutting drivers between the three drivers. So this is a Russian doll problem. Forgive me the politically incorrect analogy here. So each driver actually has sub-drivers underneath it, and these have sub-drivers too, and they all interact. Some of these interaction terms are critically important to make the drivers move towards the direction of sustainable development. The ones which we have chosen to discuss in greater detail are decentralization, inclusive innovation, and social support systems, the adaptability of solutions and policies to local needs and localized learning, the peer effects and social network effects which underpin the diffusion of new ideas and practices, and the learning and experimentation that needs to take place for local adaptation. the need to manage complexity and shared infrastructure, and last but certainly not least, coordination and governance. These factors which we consider particularly salient for the implementation and governance of the SDG. Next to the scenario narrative, we have also developed a quantitative scenario accounting tool, which we call VETRAS, to assist modeling teams in the implementation of this narrative. So we help you making quantitative assumptions with this tool. And the important aspect which this tool illustrates is twofold. I think we have seen some of the results, perhaps labeled a little bit differently, but showing the same thing. The core concept of these sustainable transition pathways is structural change. Relying on efficiency, as important as it is, won't do it. You have to do things differently. So in the original LED scenario or in its revision, you can basically say half of the reduction in energy demand is coming from structural shifts, and the other half might come from energy efficiency improvement. The second important insight of this new tool is, and I think this will be of interest to sectorial modelers, is that the tool also not only allows you to look and quantify and play with particular sectorial demand projections, but it also looks at the interdependencies between the different demand categories. So what happens in the built environment, land use, settlement patterns, density structures, has influences on transport. What happens in transport has influences on materials, etc. And as a rough guide, we were not successful in looking at all of the interlinkages. We are a small team, but the few which we have looked at actually amount already to 30% of the total energy. So these interlinkages between sectors are absolutely key and cannot be ignored. And so therefore, sectorial modelers need to think about the strategy to take these interdependencies between my transport model and the building sector model and whatever other model, the material supply model, into account. So this is basically a kind of suggestion for this new proposal. And I invite you to criticize it and to discuss it and perhaps enrich it with your own ideas. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Arno. So thank you everyone for participating in this workshop. And I just want to remind you that also we have a very nice poster presentation that also available in IIASA contact, and some of them are present basically in a presentation section of the poster. So we are encouraging you to go there as well. But before jumping to the discussion, I first want to have a big applause to all of them, all the presenters, moderator of the sessions, and also the poster presentation, that they did a very good job. I quickly just wrap up the things. I mean, we heard a lot about the energy demand, and then the word that is repeated a lot is about the human well-being. And this is a thing that is very important for us. We had a presentation on a sectoral base of how we can reduce energy demand on building and transport. And then we had a good message that we shouldn't really not only focus in one perspective, but also we should look through the whole system and whole the interactions that happening. And also we had a great presentation about the sufficiency and that how that helps. So myself, I have actually lots of questions, but first I will let you audience to bring your messages, and all are present to answer the question. And before jumping, also I want to remind you, we have a survey talking about, we want to know that what are a priority to designing the low demand scenarios and narratives. We encourage all of you to, it's just less than 5 minutes, go through the link which is available in IIASA contact and fill out that survey. That helps a lot for our reporting back, and also we will share with all of you for sure. So now floor is open for a discussion. Gunnar.
Yeah, thanks, great inputs. I have actually 3 things that I would find useful for discussing. And the first is, we saw a lot about opportunities, and that's great, but then also barriers. But barriers seem to be under discussed in this realm. And we see, like, for example, for our German pathways that a lot of things in a very affluent context even are really, really difficult to manage. And I wonder how we can bring that into the narratives and into the scenarios. And related to that, timescales, Arnulf and several others emphasized the social innovation aspect and the structural change aspect. And those things tend to be slow, I would argue, like for many things. It's just like you have a lot of inertia in behavior. You have a lot of inertia in things like form, infrastructure, all these things that would need to change. So in that respect, I wonder if we think about 1.5, we basically have to squeeze our efforts into 3 decades. And is this timescale long enough to really, really make progress on these deeper structural innovations that we need? I would find very interesting, and like I feel that the LED scenario is too optimistic on some of these aspects on the feasibility side. Third point, also you Arnulf argued that sustainable development can basically be equated with sufficiency. I hope I got you right on this point. And I fully see that there's like huge co-benefits and a big part of these demand side changes. They are highly desirable from a sustainable development perspective. But then also on the supply side, you have supply side options aren't created equal. And we have very, very unsustainable supply side options for decarbonization, and we have others that perform much, much better and also scale much faster. So I also see a risk in overemphasizing and narrowing this sustainable development agenda to the demand side, because there's also a lot of stuff that needs to happen on the supply side as well.
Thank you so much, Gunnar, for a great point. Arnulf, do you want to respond or any other things? Yeah.
Well, it's an old cliche that social change takes ages and technological change proceeds rapidly. It's exactly the opposite. And if you want to take a historical example, look at the French Revolution. So, you know, I take it some of the points. Obviously, barriers need to be discussed much more. As an excuse in the development of a narrative, you want to have pure cases. So you don't want to say, oh yeah, this is the trend, but the trend might actually not materialize because there's this obstacle. So you want to nail down first a simple story, and then you go to the complexity of barriers and so on. But this is an important research agenda. I completely agree with you. On optimism and, you know, of focus on the demand side, ignore supply side, I think this is a little bit Jesuitic kind of argument. Of course, we all emphasize the integration and the systemic integrated assessment. So of course, you do the same thing for the supply side. And of course, the demand side transformations are also transformations on the supply side, with emphasis on granularity, decentralization, localized learning. That's very different kind of technologies compared to the DAC and BECS and whatever traditional solutions are proposed on the supply side. That's the integral part. I didn't emphasize it, but it's clearly understood that the supply side relationships to the technologies and the practices need to go hand in hand of what happens on the demand side. But we start on the demand side because it is the demand side that drives the supply side and not the other way around. So so again, you know, it's a little bit like elephant in a dark room. So we seem to touch on different elements, you know, and we try to describe the same phenomenon, but just taking perhaps a little bit different angles and viewpoints. But that's precisely what we should aim at to crystallize more in the discussion.
Yeah, first Greg, and then Yamina also wants to answer.
Okay. Yeah, just to build on Arnulf's comments, I get the point, Gunnar, about the speed of transformation that's so crucial here. And one of the things that we see both in the high and low narrative and also the innovation focused narrative is we're doing a real focus on these catalytic processes. So things where you make a small change and then things start to go faster. And one of the big drivers of that is this granularity, because that creates, you know, a bunch of attributes that come with that include low adoption risk, the ability to have peer effects or information spreads really quickly that reduces the barriers to adoption, learning effects, learning by doing that reduces cost, network effects, the ability to do customization that provides new services, perhaps a new context. So we're looking at the ways that, you call it like a barrier, and maybe we just think of it as like slowness of adoption, but with the granularity, there are these processes that can go faster and that are catalytic. So that's one of the things we're really trying to look into because it's so important.
By microphone, sorry, because they cannot hear you.
It's very quick. Is it also true for behavioral changes, or is it rather a thing for demand-side technologies? Things like floor space per capita.
Yeah, I can answer this.
There was a smoking room. Everybody smoked in this room 5 years ago, still at our council meeting. Look at the room today. And take behavioral change is impossible and cannot happen fast. No, it happens fast because you have precisely these peer effect and network effects. It is an international institution. The idea is infused from somebody, and now it takes weight, and it accelerates. It enters a positive kind of spin cycle, and then the behavioral change follows.
Gunnar, just a moment. We have Yamina on online wants to respond, and then we will go to that one.
Yeah, maybe I will not go that far in the history like Arnaud to the French Revolution, but I would go to just what happened in France or in Paris. I live in Paris during the COVID time and after the COVID time. 20 years ago, I was a student in Paris. I was not using my bike because I was scared of using my bike in Paris because we did not have safe biking lines in Paris. Today, I bike with my son in the back in Paris, in the same city. I am the same person. I always wanted to use my bike, but I wasn't able to do it because I did not have the infrastructure to allow me to do that. So, and this change happened very quickly. The number of cyclists in Paris, I don't know the exact figures, but it just increased because we have the infrastructure that increased, and there is a plan to increase that. So the behavior change cannot occur without putting first in place the infrastructure that are needed to trigger sustainable behavior that is needed for the 1.5. And this could happen quite quickly if we change the narratives. I don't think that going to talk to people about reducing emissions from ppms, etc., is something that an ordinary citizen and even policymaker can understand. And I think our role is to talk to policymakers and to citizens using the wording that they are able to capture, to understand. And behind that, we have the target to go to for the 1.5. And that's why, for me, having in the definition of sufficiency the wording on well-being for all is extremely important, because this talks to the global north, to the global south, it talks to everyone, and there is no one who could be against that. I don't think people would claim that they are against that, even if there are some. So that's why I don't worry about the time frame to make this, to see these changes happen. I think it's our role to create these narratives to go in this direction, and the narratives cannot be driven by climate change. I am sorry to have to say it in this way, and it cannot be driven by energy issues, because what matters for the people is not the energy. What matters is the energy services that people need. What matters today, that it's very hot in Paris, is to be able to be in place that is cool enough to work, to live, etc. So I don't care as a citizen. If I would not have been an energy expert, I would not have cared about how this energy is produced, about how my home is cold. I just need to be in a cold space where I'm not going to be sick because of the global warming, because of the heat wave that we have. Then I had a question to Arnaud, actually, about I would like to clarify first one point. In the sufficiency community, we distinguish sufficiency from efficiency, and we do consider that there is a need for both and for decarbonizing the supply as well. And we distinguish the technological improvement is considered under efficiency and not under sufficiency. So technological innovation is different from the social innovation that is needed. The first one falls under efficiency policies. If I look look at the current policy landscape. The second one falls under sufficiency policies, which are missing from the climate and energy policy frameworks. And then I had a question to Arnulf about the model, the models actually, and what we have today. I personally do not think that putting efforts to try to improve SSPs and IAMs is worth it, because I don't think we are going anywhere with that. So I am sorry, I know I am in the wrong communities, but I would like to say it to this community. So I think we should, because what we have to do is something completely new. And for me, the main barrier to this change is us, our community, who is trying to improve something that does not work, that does not deliver, that cannot deliver for the 1.5. Arnulf, I would like to have your points on this. So because you called for an improvement of SSPs, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks, Yamina, for your note and comments. We will collect the more questions and then we will go to the round of responses. We have one waiting for a long time, please.
Many thanks. Helmut Haberl from Institute of Social Ecology here in Vienna. I fully support the idea that if we at all stick with this kind of SSP, RCP architecture in these assessments, I think we need a new storyline in that. And so I think it's around the ideas that you have presented, Arnold. I think there is also, it's important to recognize that this is a systemic phenomenon. So if we cut down, for example, on floor space, if we change settlement patterns, we will also need less concrete to build roads. And so we will need less industrial production. We will need less steel, which are two of the most GHG intensive sectors.
Closer to your mic.
Which are two of the most GHG intensive sectors. So I think this is the direction to go, because you have these systemic co-benefits. And the important thing is that we will not get there if we continue building a world that is set for very different sets of practices. And I deliberately say practices or not behavior, because I think this focus on behavior, this leads to the thinking of we have to nudge people into behaving differently, while we still continue building a world in which behaving in the way they do is the most rational thing they can do. And the idea of practices is, the practices are the routine activities of people which they perform during their day. And these practices have three key elements, which is meaning, know-how and knowledge, and the material aspect. And in the material aspect, you have all these infrastructure aspects. Simple example, if you want to have people who are biking, they need to be in a structure where they can reach their aims, which are usually not to be mobile, but to have, for example, social inclusion or education or healthcare or whatnot. Within a short distance that you can bridge with a bike. Then you need bike lanes, as we have just heard, and you need people who are able to ride bikes and who want to ride bikes. Want to ride bikes is related to this meaning aspect. What does it mean? What does it symbol to ride your bike? So, and therefore I'm fully with this systemic perspective. So in such a way, this can change quickly. And most importantly, we should stop doing the wrong things, which is building motorways and roads, building detached settlements. Austria is the European champion of sealing soils, which is related to dispersed settlements. And we are doing all these things. And then we tell people we want to nudge them into sustainable behaviors. I mean, how stupid is that, right?
Thank you so much. We have a lots of hands up. So we are collecting because also we have a responses. Please.
Hi, Rachel Freeman from UCL. I've done a fair amount of evaluation of demand programs, and I can say that there's a very small percentage who are voluntarily restrict their own consumption, maybe less than 10%. It's really strongly coupled between income and consumption. So bearing that in mind, there has to be a motivation for any kind of gravitation towards an idea of sufficiency, which again is politically a super hot potato. I don't think any politician really wants to tackle it. So like in the UK, we've had loads of many energy efficiency programs, but almost nothing on consumption. So I think that I'm really glad to hear about social innovation, because I basically think that the infrastructure is what it is, and it's going to be that way probably at least for the next 20 years when we have this need to decrease. So I would say that the main problem is any kind of sufficiency can be done temporarily, right? If we can actually achieve a sort of wartime feeling of yeah, I'm going to reduce, but this is only temporary. And once we get all the technologies built, we'll be able to go back to, you know, having whatever we need or want. So there has to be a kind of bribe to it too. I think what is the motivation? Can people make money from that? Not just energy savings, but other kinds of trading, or so there has to be a personal motivation, and we cannot expect everyone to think that that is climate change. So can we think more practically and get our, you know, worldview into the everyday people and find out what moves them?
Thank you so much. So we have a couple of other questions, and I really encourage to keep it short. Just give it to her. Yeah, very, very short, because we also want to have a discussion.
Okay, so just talking really fast about the high with low. You asked us what we thought. I think it's great. I find a lot of synergies and similarities with the wording we use, how we are trying to go about this with countries. So all of that is great. About innovation, we use the term systems innovation, and we try to, with our narrative, say innovation is perceived as technological change only, and that is not what is going to help us. But my question is, so how do we move forward? Because in a way, I was just before in a different session, and the narrative was completely different. And it was a Beyond GDP session focused on how to more or less fix little things here and there to keep on using it. So it seems to me like we have a mass of convinced. And so how do we move forward with these? I think we have to start using the same narrative, the same wording, but we have to come to some synergies and what we're all doing. You're on the modeling side. OECD is very close to countries, but we need to find ways of better communicating and convincing the countries to go with these narratives, to start thinking about a high with low scenario, at least to put it there in their long-term low emission development strategies, which is never there. So, and maybe just another quick question just for Eva and the other presentation on France, maybe they can tell us, what are these French authorities doing with these scenarios? Did it work? Did it not work? Did they convince someone to do things differently by having these new narratives, these new scenarios? I would be super curious to know. Sorry, I didn't keep it.
Paul, is it okay that these two are from the French speakers go through, and then we will go to you? Yeah, Yves?
Do you want me to answer that question? Sorry.
Yeah, it was a question from our colleagues here. Did you hear that?
Yeah, well, the question about the French authority, I mean, it would be quite long to comment rightly on it. I mean, altogether, the sufficiency made its way really through in the public debate. It's in the first article of the law on energy transition, which was passed in 2015, for instance. But I mean, it is discussed. We still have to convince policymakers that they need to shift the narrative. I mean, President Macron is referring to sufficiency, but he actually talks about efficiency. And the next sentence, he says, we still need to produce more. It's a condition for maintaining socially our system. So it's still a complete productivist narrative, which we need to shift. Having said that, just a few quick comments. I'm very much in line with Arnulf's proposal of change of framework, apart from one very crucial point, which is I would not I would really call for distinguishing sufficiency and sustainability. Sufficiency is at the core of reaching sustainability, but sustainability calls for very much more things. When it comes to the time and the obstacles, I see really three fields where we face obstacles. It's democracy, and we need local implementation. We need the time to convince people, and sufficiency is a very good way to have this local democratic discussion. And then granularity compensates for the time taken. We have economics, and we need to shift to different business models. And again, sufficiency is a very good way to discuss how business models could evolve to create value by saving resources instead of destroying them. And we have the elephant in the room from my perspective, which is geopolitics. We need to talk about sharing resources between North and South. And again, sufficiency is a very good narrative to develop that discussion. So we need sufficiency as a new narrative, as a governance principle, as a leverage, but not alone. We also need efficiency, and we need renewables, which is why we call for really identifying it and distinguish it. One last word, sufficiency is key to achieve both fast results and the deepest results that we need in the long term. The servicial sufficiency, it's really the only tool we have to deliver in the next month. And we need to implement that. But the structural part of sufficiency is what we need to reach the deepest changes, the deepest cuts in emissions. And we also need to implement like urban planning and things like that in the short term to have this delivered. When you think about carbon budget, both this action and the very fast, the first part of the trajectory and the deepest action on the long part are key to reduce our carbon budget. So sufficiency again.
Thank you so much, Elise, because we are running out of time. We will take one question quickly, Paul, and then Bas wants to wrap up. I know it's a very hot topic. I mean, I also would like to continue, but I know all of you are so busy. Thanks a lot for all of you. Paul.
Super quick to just reflect on the practical difficulty of quantifying and analyzing this, right? So I model transport in IAMs. I do not make any defense against Yamina's criticisms. I think many of them are good. We already struggle to represent the extant system. And if, per Greg's suggestion, the changes in these systems are going to be, many, granular, heterogeneous, responsive to local context, it will be even more difficult to make an assessment of, do these add up to a total sustainability? So that I don't have an answer, but I think that's a major challenge that we're going to have to confront in order to tell the story of these high to low scenarios and how they can deliver on the goals that we've expressed, the SDGs. Yeah, we could.
So I think perhaps you should look to other disciplines that we can learn more. If the biologists can deal with the complexity of these different ecosystems, then I think we have hope to deal ultimately with the complexity of social systems and solutions to the problems the social systems generate. I'm a hopeless optimist.
No, thanks. I think that's a great point. I think that is actually why EDIT is such an interesting experiment at the moment to actually see whether we can make this work on a community level on the energy and mitigation side as well as an experiment, basically. Yeah, wrapping up, I very much see what I read is the sort of the cry for that we need to structure the integrated solution space that where policymakers are interested in, and where we also as a community want to explore where what the type of different solutions are that we would have to solve climate the climate change problem. And I hope actually also that at this point in the biodiversity session that's next to this, they have a similar discussion on how to actually go beyond what is the SSP RCP matrix and what is that other dimension that we need to actually look more to be able to have to explore that solution space in an integrated way, structured as communities. Question to me from the economics perspective, then what do we need from the on the community level here? What do we need beyond individual projects or efforts in initiatives that can structure this for themselves? What do we need to, for example, connect this from the mitigation side towards the impact side? Are climate impacts different in a LED scenario? Is society more or less vulnerable to climate impacts of certain kinds and disruptions of certain kinds or not? Or is it such an efficient, optimized society that is actually also very vulnerable to disruptions potentially or so? And I think that how do you then archetypical throw that over the fence from one community to another? And what are the indicators that we need to have on a community level, and what do we do individually in individual studies? I think is a very important question going forward. And you brought up baseline uncertainty. I think it's still a dimension that matters in the sense that trying to implement a low energy demand scenario in a world that's sort of coherently all wanting to aim for sustainability is different than trying to aim for a low energy demand scenario space in a world where Russia attacks its neighbors, or where you have major economic blocs not collaborating. That still matters in how you get to that solution space. And that's where I think we also shouldn't be too hung up on sort of the exact 20 cells in the SSP-RCP matrix to say, okay, that this needs to be exactly this GDP with this solution space only. It's on the rows of that matrix, it's basically, yes, the rows. It's just the levels of climate change. That's what we hand off to the climate modelers. And then the rest is there for mitigation and impacts communities to play around with, to explore. And I prefer to see this community framework as building blocks that we can use to create our individual scenarios in projects. And rather than to go actually to something that needs to be very coherent, because that's sort of set how it has to be in that cell of the matrix. I think we should interpret it much more flexibly. And there's a certain core. You want to have a sustainable, low climate emission scenario, or you want to have more unsustainable options there that also solve the climate problem, but still don't solve maybe your societal issues. I think there's a lot of food for thought here going into lunch.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, most of us, I mean, officially the session is closed, but of course some of us are here. We can keep our discussion. But Yamina, do you want to have a very last remark, because the session is over, but I'm happy because you are just leaving. So please.
Yes. I would like to answer a little bit more about the French. What happened in France is that France is the only country where we have 3 scenarios based on sufficiency, efficiency, renewable that were published. And one of them is from the French Energy Agency, and the other one is from French electricity transmission organization, and the other one is from Negawatt. So after more than 20 years of work done by Negawatt, and after having the word sufficiency in the French law, now we have these scenarios. So I would be more, I have a hope, even if I'm not very happy with the government that we have, with the election in France, that we will be able to make sufficiency a reality in more than the northern region that was presented by Barbara. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the audience and great discussion and lots of good questions. So you can always contact the speakers and also others through the IIASA contact. But we will be also here. We can continue chit-chatting till going to the lunch, basically. Thank you so much for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.